Yes. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Zoom call with Professor Glenn Robert. He'll be sharing about his work in co-production, and I'm really excited to hear him speak today. Before we start, let me just mention a few things. If you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself yet, there's an opportunity to do so in the messaging box or the chat box. So what you do is if you go to the bottom of the screen and there's a little bubble there and it says chat, and you can click on it and type in any comments you would have. So for now, it'd be nice if we all introduce ourselves so we get to know each other a little bit more. We will also be recording this session and we'll make it available on Q's YouTube page. The slides will also be available after the event. And towards the end of Glenn's talk, we'll have a short time of question and answer. So feel free to use the chat box to ask questions, or you can ask it personally as well at the end of Glenn's talk. Okay. Let's start. So let me just briefly introduce Professor Glenn Robert. He's Chair in Healthcare Quality and Innovation at King's College London. He's a pioneering voice in co-production and service improvement, and also a co-developer of EBCD, the experience-based co-design. So Glenn has kindly agreed to share with us his perspective on a new research study, a multi-million-pound research study, looking at combining health and social care, exploring, measuring, and improving co-production at national, regional, and local levels. So this work is led by Professor Sofia sorry, I can't pronounce the surname. Kjellström, yeah, of Jönköping Academy. And so just over to you, Glenn, to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Rosemary. Thanks. I'll just share my slides. Right, hopefully you can see my slides.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, as Rosemary said, what I'm going to be talking about towards the end of this presentation is a new collaborative research program that we've set up between Jönköping University in Sweden and King's College London. But before we get there, I thought I might just structure what I'm going to say around co-production in terms of the main features of the research program, which are around exploring, enhancing, and measuring the value of co-production. So, there we go. So what I'll do is I'm going to take those three features, explore, enhance, and measure, and talk about co-production in relation to those. So explore in terms of the origins of co-production. I won't go into a lengthy historical review of where co-production came from, but I think it is important whenever discussing co-production that we're clear on what perspectives we're bringing to the topic. So I'll do a bit of that. Then I'll talk in terms of enhancing of what's happened really over the last 10 years or so, where after a period where co-production wasn't really, didn't really have a high profile in public management, in public policy, it suddenly came back into vogue. And I'll talk about that, and particularly the work of Paul Boutalden and others who have begun to raise the importance of co-production in terms of the future directions for healthcare quality improvement. Then I'll talk about measures. I'll talk about the evidence base and new measures that are being developed and argued for in relation to co-production, before I then give you a very brief overview of the research program, which is a 6-year research program which began January 2019. Okay, so as part of that research program, we've been doing a scoping review, getting a sense of where the literature is around co-production in health and social care services. And this graph may well hide a multitude of sins in terms of how co-production has been defined and described. But I think what is not up for debate is that there has been increasing interest in the notion of co-production, however that might be conceptualized and practiced in health and social care services and healthcare quality work. So, as I say, I've just got one slide where I'm just going to set out what my starting position is around co-production, because I think it's important for the sake of clarity to do that. So this is a really nice blog by Bridget Nerlich, who's Emeritus Professor at Nottingham, which is just setting out that there are various bodies of knowledge and literatures around co-production. One of them stems very much from Elinor Ostron's work and public administration, public management in the US in the 70s, and that's absolutely where I'm going to place myself and how this talk is going to be framed. But there are other bodies of knowledge from, for example, science technology studies, looking at how society politics affect scientific research and technological innovation, and indeed vice versa. And they also use co-production, the term co-production, in a slightly different way in terms of how knowledge is co-produced in a social context. Sometimes when you talk to people about co-production, they are coming from different perspectives, and they will be coming from that STS perspective when you're talking from a public administration, public management. And sometimes, therefore, there's a confusion around how the term is being applied. So I just wanted to set this out. It's well worth, if you're interested in that, it's well worth having a look at Bridget's blog and also the paper that I've referenced at the bottom of this slide, which sets out the history of these different bodies of knowledge. But this talk is going to be very much centered around Elinor Ostron's work, public administration, public service management. So back in the 1970s, Kjellström and her colleagues, Indiana University, developed this term co-production to describe the potential relationships that could exist between regular producers, for example, health workers, and clients who want to be healthier persons. And co-production, as they described it, as one way that synergy between what a government does and what citizens do can occur. So that's Elinor Kjellström, and her original foundational work was around police services in and around Chicago. And why was it that some police services were more effective than others? And to cut a long story short, what it essentially came down to were the citizen activities in those different localities and communities. So the effectiveness of police services was shaped very much by how citizens contributed to or not the work of police services. And this is the first time that Kjellström and her colleagues used the phrase co-producers. This is a paper in 1978, but the research was done a little bit earlier than that. But she was saying that citizens may call the police about a victimization in progress or give evidence that leads to the arrest of a felon. In these instances, citizen activities supplement police activities in the production of an output, the arrest. Citizens then, in some instances become co-producers with police through the contribution of their activities. The activities of citizens influence public agency outputs, objective community conditions, and citizen perceptions. It should also be noted, and this is important, we'll come back to this, that citizen activities don't always lead to positive outcomes. You can also, as well as co-producing value, you can co-destruct value. So in this example, citizens may attempt to thwart the efforts of police by
I've seen some black people in my street.
Or giving false information.
They must be criminals.
So Duros et al. Has, this is a big body of work. I'm giving you a very short version of everything that Kjellström was working on. But Duros et al. Have sort of summarized what Elinor Kjellström's conditions for co-production were in the following way. That it brings together diverse forms of expertise, resources or assets in new and creative ways. That there's flexibility for participants so people can step in and out of these processes. That there's transparent, accountable relationships between participants. And that there are incentives to encourage inputs from both officials and citizens. And so through this work that came much later, beginning to explicate a theory of change for co-production. What is it that goes on in these co-production processes that explains their outcomes? And after Kjellström's original work, she then went on to do all of her much more famous work in a way around governing the commons, for which she won the Nobel Prize for Economics, the first woman to ever win the Nobel Prize for Economics. But other people did pick up this notion, this concept of co-production. So Edgar Kahn, in his book, No More Throwaway People, which took a very political, radical view of the role of co-production in societies, that it should be about dismantling institutions, changing their culture and practices and rebalancing power. It should be about social justice and inclusion. And it became that various popularized forms of co-production came to the fore. For example, time banking, and Edgar Kahn's work around that is perhaps the best known. But Kjellström had gone off to do her Nobel Prize winning work around governing the commons. It was a time of Reaganomics, Thatcherism, the free market. where citizens weren't seen as having a key role to play in the delivery outcomes of public services. They were seen as consumers, and they were making choices, and it was that drove the quality and effectiveness of services. So co-production tended to be overshadowed for quite a while after Kjellström's original work. Looking back, it was sound in itself, but academics such as John Alford in Australia argued that insufficiently elaborated to deal with various facets of co-production. So who are the co-producers who are stepping into these processes? What motivates them to co-produce? Is this about a very important question around private or public value, raises questions of equity from these types of co-production processes. And is this just about services? Is it about products? Is it about both? So academics began to revisit Kjellström's original work and to ask these types of questions. And in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been really quite a growth in academic research around how co-production plays out in societies and some of the mechanisms that drives these processes. There are as many definitions as you like for co-production. I've just picked out these 3 because for me they speak to the fundamental features. So Kjellström herself, co-production implies that citizens can play an active role in producing public goods and services of consequence to them. Much later, from the New Economics Foundation, co-production means delivering public services in an equal and reciprocal relationship between professionals using services, their families and their neighbours. And Catherine Needham, co-production, people who use services contribute to the production of services. And I think the common feature here, which is really important to hold on to, is this fundamental, vital role of citizens in co-production processes. But for as long as co-production has been around as a concept, people have argued around the definition. So this is a paper back from 1983. It does have a lot of elasticity as a term. As I said at the start, there are different bodies of knowledge which use the term co-production in different ways. So you have public management, service management, science technology studies, for example. One of the questions is, what services are not co-produced? So co-production is inherent to any service interaction. If you walk into a GP practice and have a good interaction with the receptionist, that interaction is being co-produced. Equally, if it's not a good interaction, it is being co-produced. So when we talk about co-production, is it just a redescription of what happens anyway, of a social phenomena? Or is it really can it be a transformative model for the future? And when we come on to talk about some of Paul Bertelden's work recently in the quality improvement context, we'll return to these types of questions. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of sort of the origins and how it's been played out over the last 40 or 50 years or so. So what I wanted to talk about now was to bring us up to date and particularly begin to apply this to the quality improvement science context in healthcare. So Paul Bertelden, actually this is Maren Bertelden's paper in BMJ Quality and Safety. Co-production of health describes the interdependent work of users and professionals who are creating, designing, producing, delivering, assessing and evaluating the relationships and actions that contribute to the health of individuals and populations. At its core, again, are the interactions of patients and professionals in different roles and degrees of shared work. So around about sort of, I guess, 2007, 2008, co-production enjoyed some sort of renewed interest. And there were several reasons for that, nicely set out in the Needham and Carr paper that I've referenced here. But around that time, people were beginning to, well, had been for some time perhaps, questioning the value of relying on new public management as a way of improving the efficiency and quality of public services. So there was a reduced faith in target-based and market processes, increased call for devolution of power to users and citizens, certainly pressure to increase efficiency and reduce public spending, awareness of the importance of knowledge generated via user interaction, a determination to make care more personal, increasing effective participation of users. And as Alford argues, co-production began to be seen as part of the reaction against new public management as adding to the repertoire of institutional arrangements to public sector organisations in seeking to achieve their purposes. So around 2007, 2008, I guess, co-production suddenly took off again, and there was much more interest from public sector policymakers. And Becky Maltby's neatly set out how co-production can be viewed and was viewed at the time. it could be, as I've just mentioned, just be a description of how services rely on productive input from users. So all interactions are co-produced, and co-production can be used as a descriptor of that. It can also be used as a way of recognizing the input that people can make to the design and delivery of services. So in a more sort of proactive way, we can build into our improvement approaches that role for people and citizens. And then finally, it could also be a more transformative way of thinking about the design, delivery, management, and government and services. And the term gets used in those various ways. But in terms of the fundamental features, this is a nice set of features from the New Economics Foundation. Genuine co-production will always define public service clients as assets who have skills that are vital to the delivery of services, define work to include anything that people do to support each other, include some element of reciprocity. Reciprocity was always a key feature of Kjellström's original work as well. Building communities, sustainable networks of support, and supporting resilience, so giving opportunities to take risks and learn. So co-production will always have those types of features. And in the years since there was renewed interest in co-production, there have been various attempts to build networks and communities of practice around co-production. There's a very well-established one in Scotland, the Scottish Co-Production Network. Actually, they're having their co-production week in November. They have various resources on their website, learning resources, case studies, examples of co-production projects across the public sector, not just in the healthcare sector, but across the public sector. Another example is the Co-Production Network for Wales. They've just done quite a lot of work on developing a resource library actually for co-production. But the screenshot I've included here is an audit tool that they've developed, self-assessment tool for organisations around co-production, which I think is quite a helpful tool, looking at assets, networks, outcomes, relationships, and catalysts. These are just examples of some of the communities of practice that have sprung up around the notion of the co-production of public services. And then there are examples like Governance International, where more consultancy models, this is actually run by Tony Bovard and Alka Loeffler, who have written quite a lot academically around co-production in the public sector, again, not specifically to healthcare, but consultancy models to help third sector, public sector organisations make more use of co-production and co-productive processes. Okay, so what has this got to do with improving healthcare quality? So, 2016, Don Berwick, former CEO of the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, of course, in the US, writing in JAMA, writing about the need for era-free for quality improvement in medicine and healthcare. The more patients and families become empowered, shaping their care, the better that care becomes, and the lower the costs. Clinicians and those who train them should learn how to ask less, what is the matter with you, and more, what matters to you. Co-production, co-design, and person-centered care are among the new watchwords, and professionals and those who train them should master these ideas and embrace the transfer of control over people's lives to the people. So key opinion leaders like Don Berwick very clearly placing co-production as the next era as part of the next era of healthcare quality improvement work. And you may all be familiar with this, but I think it neatly represents how co-production has been framed as that third era. So we've had new public management, we've had quality improvement, and now we're on allegedly the cusp of this third area of mobilizing social action and co-production. When I've seen this presented, it's often done as if we are on that cusp, that we've somehow done quality improvement and we're now moving to this third era. And I suspect from my experience of studying quality improvement in healthcare organizations, we're actually much nearer that cusp between the first era of new public management and quality improvement than we are towards the third era. But that at least is the frame in which co-production is being placed. And so paper by Maren Bertelden and Paul Bertelden and others in 2015, about the same time that Don Berwick was setting out that third era, talking about we may need to look again at co-production. It may have something to offer for healthcare quality improvement work. And they were arguing that from this public service administration and management perspective, so that, again, that's very much Eleanor Kjellström's work and those that followed her, that we may need to think again about how we educate professionals and the public to recalibrate their expectations, develop and sustain new habits if we are to co-produce health. And that the healthcare system redesign needs to facilitate co-created relationships between patients and healthcare professionals, and that we need to recognize there are powerful actions and forces that shape health outside the boundaries of our healthcare system. So most improvement science, quality improvement work happening within the constraints of healthcare organizations, healthcare systems. And if we take a co-production perspective, then we need to begin to look much more broadly than that. And importantly, we need to measure, develop new measures, apply new measures to accurately reflect and help us understand what co-produced services and results should look like. And I suspect most of you are familiar with. So this is the model that in the 2015 paper that Maren Bertelden led on, where they set out what this new model of co-produced high-value healthcare service might look like. So placing the interactions between patients and professionals, not only within the healthcare system, but in the wider community and society, and recognizing that it's in those wider interactions that we can co-produce health. And then in a subsequent paper, an essay in the BMJ, Paul Bertelden took this a little bit further, and I think interestingly acknowledged that through all his experience of working around quality improvement, improvement science work since the founding of the IHI in the US, that work had largely been based on a goods dominant logic. So taking improvement approaches from the manufacturing sector around developing products and goods. And in this essay, Paul was saying that's got us so far, but perhaps we now need to think about focusing more attention on a service dominant logic. And what would that do for our quality improvement science approaches? It's not to say, it's not a duality. It's not to say that we need to now reject everything we've done around goods and product logics, but that perhaps we need to attend much more to this notion of service and how co-production might help us to do that. And so here, Paul was drawing on the work by Varga and Lush, comparing goods versus service dominant logics. And he was arguing that on the left-hand side of this table, most of the quality improvement approaches that we've taken from the manufacturing sector were predicated on these types of concepts around goods, products, value-added, supply chains, etc. Whereas if we shifted to the service dominant concepts around service experiences, co-creation of value, learning, dialogue, then what would our improvement approaches look like? What impact would that have on that third era if we're shifting to a third era of quality improvement? And this harks back very much to Kjellström's original work. So there she was saying the production of a service as contrasted to a good was difficult without the active participation of those supposedly receiving the service. If citizens do not report suspicious events rapidly to a police department, there's little that that department can do to reduce crime in an area or solve the crimes better. So there's a very clear link, I think, in Paul's BMJ 2018 essay back through service dominant logic, service dominant concepts, all the way back to Kjellström's original work around the co-production of public services. And importantly, and I think this is important for when we think about health and healthcare, there are different levels of co-production. So it can be at the individual level, the group level, or the collective level. And most of the work in health and healthcare has certainly been at the individual level around, for example, shared decision-making, around enhancing interactions between individual patients and their clinicians. There's been less around the group level, the voluntary active participation by several citizens, which may require some formal coordination mechanisms between service providers and citizens. There are some examples of these. There was a paper just a few weeks ago by Glyn Elwyn and colleagues, which gave some examples of these group levels of co-production. And then at the collective level, where co-production activities result in benefits which may be realized by the entire community, regardless of whether they participate in the service delivery process. And I think an example of this, certainly from the UK sector at the moment, might be the recent quite rapid growth in volunteering and volunteering activities in hospitals. I think that's a good example of potentially at least collective co-production. So as a contemporary example at the individual level, work by Casey Burma and others at the Mayo Clinic in the US, developing a discussion aid for clinicians and other health professionals to use so that patients can, so that both patients and clinicians can better understand the patient's capacity and treatment burden. And alongside that, not just a structured conversation tool, but also coaching for staff in how to engage with these new interactions and processes. So that's at the individual level. And as I say, that's where most of the work, I think, around co-production in healthcare has been focused. But then if you think more at the collective level, I think there are some very good recent examples that have had lots of publicity. You've probably all heard about the Wigan deal and the work that's been done there, using asset-based approaches. So having a formal compact, a formal contract between citizens and public sector organisations about respective roles and new ways of working, and using asset-based community development as a way essentially to co-produce health. So that these examples are coming, if not, albeit they may not always be framed in terms of improvement science and quality improvement work. But whilst healthcare is a service sector in which there is a particular impetus for co-productive approaches, it's also a setting in which the barriers to co-production may be particularly prohibitive. And McMillan and Needham have set this out quite nicely, I think. In the original Marin Bertelden paper as well, they set out the challenges to co-producing health and healthcare. So diversity amongst patients, not all patients have the desire or capacity to participate in co-producing their health. So that raises immediately questions of equity. Power and responsibility. It may not always be desirable to share power and responsibility between patients and professionals in all situations. And there may be situations where patients don't have the resources to participate in co-production, and the healthcare system simply can't neglect them in those situations. There may also be issues of sort of legal liability where citizens make choices that run counter to a traditional evidence base, and how we negotiate those types of difficult discussions. Bertelden et al. Also talk about letting the pendulum swing too far. Are we transferring too much care responsibility to the patients and away from the professionals? And it is challenging for professionals to respect patients as experts in some situations. And then in terms of, again, Bertelden raised this question of contextualizing standardization. So there's the current trend towards standardizing what we do in healthcare professional work is challenged by this notion of co-producing health. And finally, and I think the most important one I want to say a little bit more about is a resistant healthcare culture. So this is difficult and time-consuming work, and professionals may not necessarily have the skills or experience required to engage in these types of co-production processes, as of course may patients. Some of Casey Burma's work around increasing coaching capacity in staff is in part a response to that. And while professionals may welcome a more co-productive ways of working, this often requires quite a shift in practice and organizational culture. And I think it's interesting to reflect again that Kjellström was writing about these issues quite some time ago. So making these systems work effectively over the long run requires as much change in the attitude and operational routines of public agencies as it requires input from residents in all phases of the project. Designing institutional arrangements that help successful co-productive strategies is far more daunting than demonstrating their theoretical existence. And I think that's very important. If you accept my argument that most of the co-production work that goes on in healthcare is at that individual level, I think the next stage of research and indeed practice is around thinking how we enhance group and collective institutional organizational arrangements that enable co-productive processes. Okay, so just a few words about the evidence base around co-production, and then I'll briefly introduce the Samskaara project, which we hope is going to at least take us forward on some of the questions I've been raising. So, co-production is not, of course, universally advantageous, nor is a process that occurs spontaneously simply because substantial benefits could be achieved. Kjellström's work. And then more directly, recent paper from Dudau et al. Call for constructive disenchantment with the magic that surrounds co-design, co-production and value co-creation in public services. So there is a great deal of rhetoric around this prefix co-design, co-production, value co-creation. And we need to be much more critical of how that is being applied and evaluated. I'll go through this briefly. As Rosemary said, I'll let you have the slides, but there have been several systematic reviews of co-production in the public sector generally, or specifically in the healthcare setting quite recently. Essentially what they show is that lots of them look at what are key success factors. They create typologies of different forms of co-production. There's very little attention has been paid until relatively recently to outcomes, impacts, or benefits. In healthcare specifically, Palumbo's review looked at how conflicting priorities and beliefs between service providers and service users, as well as access to information, are major barriers to co-production. Trish Greenhouse and colleagues did a review of different models of co-creation, which encompassed co-design and co-production, and looked again at key success principles. They're talking there about things like system thinking, processes of co-creation, the creative nature of these projects, and leadership styles. But again, noted that impact is by no means guaranteed. So what we have actually is we're quite weak on evidence of impacts of co-production, both across the public sector and in healthcare specifically. There's a breadth of terms and a lack of focus, and as this is partly relating to that point I was making about the prefix co, as those meanings become more diffuse and confused, it gets much harder to look across these projects and to build up any sort of evidence base, and claims made for the potential become even more fanciful. There are lots of single case studies, numbering in the thousands. They are very strong on the nature and level of co-production. So what goes on in these projects, what are the mechanisms, what are the features, where are they happening, but very weak on wider long-term impacts. That's why things like the Wigan deal and similar asset-based community development projects at that kind of scale are very interesting, I think. There's still this hope they can transform, co-production can transform service outcomes without increasing costs. That's unproven, although some of the evaluations of, for example, the Wigan deal would suggest that we are getting better evidence around that. And typically there's a lack of any kind of longitudinal evaluation. So these are often evaluated, if they're evaluated at all, in quite short-term timescales. But I think in the last couple of years, we're probably moving forward on the evidence base. So Branson analysis is a nice collection, again, looking across the public services as a whole, not just in healthcare, make the argument that while most research around co-production up to the last couple of years has been really agenda setting, we're moving much more towards fact finding. So we're seeing more cross-national studies, comparative case studies, experimental designs, longitudinal studies, and this has implications for the way in which we've designed the Samskaara program that I'll be telling you a little bit about in a moment, because it meets several of those features. And importantly, I think around measures is the work that's going on around public value and how it can be measured, managed, and grown, and how we're beginning to apply that to co-production, co-design. So I know that the Health Foundation was involved in some of this original work around realizing the value. So how are we thinking about the value of these types of projects and indeed improvement work more generally? Focusing not only on specific clinical outcomes and what the system values, patient experience, immediate outcomes, individual outcomes, but much more around wider health and well-being impacts, what people in their communities value, well-being, outcomes over time, and the very important question of equity. So these kind of discussions that are going on around the broader nature of value that we want to encourage and evaluate in our co-production work is very important, I think, in terms of how we measure these types of processes. So back to the prefix co-creation of value, co-production, co-design, collaborative evaluation. I saw one the other day that was co-decision, which I hadn't come across before. This prefix is cropping up everywhere. So we're in this kind of era of DIY is good, but do it together is better. It's time to co-everything. We need to be much more critical about some of this work. This is a really nice slide. This isn't my work. This is from a co-production workshop in Surrey. I think it's quite an old slide now, but so you've been asked to co-produce. How can you do so relatively painlessly without letting users muck about with your precious service? And I think if you go through this kind of flow chart, I think there's a lot of truth around both co-production and co-design projects that that I sometimes hear about. So if you choose the service you want to co-produce, you talk to people, no, are you mad? Say you did declare success, write a case study, etc., etc. If you go for all of these, there is a lot of truth about the way in which often these projects lose fidelity quite quickly to the sort of core features of what I would see as co-production and co-design. And so we need to get much more critical about co-production. Where are we with that? Well, there's been relatively little critical engagement with issues of power and power relations, which are fundamental to these types of processes. There has been some good work. Michelle Farr has published some good stuff on this. Coming back to notions of equality, equal contribution, and mutual respect being difficult to establish in health and social care. That were some of the barriers that Needham and colleagues were raising earlier in the presentation. There's a risk that service user empowerment and democratization of service provision risk being deployed very simplistically. And increasingly, people are beginning to look at academics are beginning to look at the dark side of co-production, the potential dark side of co-production. Are we just reinforcing inequalities because of who steps into these processes? That's certainly a risk. To what extent is this captured co-production? That we've got some kind of substitution of labour going on here. So in times of austerity, we draw more on the assets of patients and shift responsibility from professionals. And is co-production and the language of co-production just being used as cover for political decisions? So lots of issues around power and politics in these types of processes. And relatively recently, there's been more critical engagement with these types of issues. Okay, so that's a very quick run through of some of the origins of co-production, how it's come into healthcare quality improvement science work in the last few years, and how we might, what the evidence base is and how we might perhaps move forward in assessing the value of these types of approaches. So what I'm going to do now, just for the last couple of minutes, is just tell you about this co-production research program that we've set up with Jönköping in Sweden. So it's funded by Forte, which is the Swedish sort of health and well-being research board. It sounds much better in Swedish krona. In Swedish krona, it's 26.6 million, but it's 2.3 million pounds in sterling, and most of it's very much led by Jönköping. They're the major partners in this project. So it's a program for 6 years. It began in January 2019, and there's an open access study protocol in BMJ Open if you want to dig more into the detail. Importantly, I think we're trying to sort of live the values of what it is we're studying. We're taking we've established a partnership learning group of citizens, service users, former service users, to advise us on how the program is implemented and how we can generate the most value from the program. So at Jönköping Academy, they already have a Centre for Co-Production, and this project sits within that. At the program level for Samskaara, we've consulted with those citizen service users who are leading the case studies. We spoke with them in the spring. We interviewed them regarding what they felt were the best processes and structures to underpin the formative interactive research process that we're trying to undertake. And we're working with them to assure the relevance of the questions that we're asking across the case studies and the practical value of the findings, as I said. So those citizen service users attended our annual retreat in 2019, and indeed one of them led a workshop for us there. We have further meetings this autumn with a wider range of patient organisations as part of the ongoing development of the Centre for Co-Production. And we'll be having the first formal partnership learning meeting in early 2020. And that's at the program level. Of course, within the individual case studies, we have 10 case studies of co-production or co-design within the program. They each have their own forms of patient citizen involvement. Two of the UK case studies are undertaking co-design of interventions. In the Swedish case studies, they're involving patients in different ways in the improvement work and the study of that improvement work.
Anyway,
so this was the workshop that was led by Jay McGrath at We Co-Produce, which is a third sector organisation in London, and indeed their work is one of our case studies that we're studying as part of Samskaara. If you haven't seen this, we were lucky enough to sort of pilot it and try it out. It's a trigger for getting groups to think about what co-production is and might not be. And on the reverse side of this, there are various conversation prompts to get people talking about what they see in this graphic. And I have to say it worked really, really well. So if you haven't, if you're looking for some sort of mechanism trigger to begin conversations around co-production in your organization or in your service, do get in touch with Jane and ask her about the Guerrilla Guide, The Art of Co-Production, because we found it a very valuable way of bringing different perspectives together around co-production and to try and tease out what were the key features of co-productive processes. So there are various researchers involved in the program, both in Sweden and the UK, and PhD students. And the aim and the research questions are as follows. So the overall study is to explore, enhance, and measure the value of co-production for improving the health and social care of citizens. We've got 4 research objectives. So the program is really premised on the fact that we think there are 3 major gaps in the knowledge base around the co-production of health, co-producing health at the moment. We think those relate to measurements, mechanisms, and management. So in terms of measurements, our objectives at the program level are to develop, test, and establish robust measures of co-production processes and of the outcomes of co-production for participants and wider constituencies. So this is where these very interesting debates now around value in the public sector, I think, are going to play into this particular research objective. Secondly, around mechanisms to study the social processes and organizational forms that enable inclusive and reciprocal co-production. So this is speaking again to that issue around what are the appropriate institutional arrangements that are necessary to enable enhanced co-production. Around management, to explore effective systems and styles of leadership for co-production and how those systems and styles need to be adaptable and change over time. And then the 4th objective is really building out from those first 3 around developing explanatory models and other outputs based on the synthesis of the findings in relation to objectives 1 and 3. So those are, and so neatly and slightly contrived, we have a 4M model, although I see measurements has been spelled incorrectly, that must be lost in translation. So we have this 4M model of measurements, mechanisms, management, and model that sort of underpins the whole program. And the design, it's a longitudinal comparative case study design. We have 10 case studies, 7 in Sweden, 3 in the UK, using both qualitative and quantitative methods. It is very interactive and formative research, so we're feeding back across the case studies as we go to our partnership learning group, to those leading the case studies, and we'll be trying out, once we get the fieldwork really up and running, we'll be trying out interventions, new ways of measures, et cetera, and learning as we go. So it's very much around cross-case analysis, sense-making process with participants in those 10 case studies, citizen leaders, and the researchers. As I say, there are 10 case studies, 7 in Sweden, 3 in the UK, and it began in 2019. And most of the work up to now, the first 9-10 months of the program, has been around a scoping review, and I'll bring you an update on that in just a moment. But just to give you an example of a couple of the case studies, I haven't got time to go through them all, but just one of the UK and one of the Swedish case studies that are part of the program. So we co-produce, who produced that nice The Art of Co-Production tool that I mentioned just now, a community interest company set up by a user of mental health services. They act as a consultancy for a range of projects on health and social care and well-being. And they use very creative ways, like the Art of Co-Production, of enabling different ways of having more democratic conversations between providers and users, particularly of mental health services. So our case study work here for the next couple of years is around an innovation wards project that they're running, where they've been commissioned to implement previously co-produced service standards in 2 mental health wards. So this is former service user leaders leading a process to implement these co-produced service standards, and we as researchers will be working alongside them in a formative way to study how they get on with that project. So that's just one of the 10 case studies. Another one, the final one I'll share with you is one of the Swedish case studies around the ESTER network, which originated in Jönköping. Some of you may have heard of ESTER. It's being used in the UK in Kent. It's also now being used in Singapore. So it's very much a focus on care coordination and person-centered care. They've created ESTER as an imaginary persona from which lots of narratives and Esther cafes are used to develop ways of improving the quality of care, and the citizens are involved in both setting the network strategy and in training the Esther coaches. So again, there's a coaching capacity issue around enabling staff to take part in these types of processes in better ways. So that's just another example, a second example of the 10 case studies. As I said, we're using a very formative, interactive approach. So interactive research is quite strong in Sweden. We tend to talk more in the UK around formative research, but the type of model that we're using is this. So we have the researchers, citizen users, and the staff working together in joint learning, problem definition, deciding on methods, analysis, and how we present and disseminate the results. And so that is very much underpinning the formative interactive approach that we're taking across the programme as a whole. Just a quick word on the scoping review, last couple of slides. So we wanted to explore the current knowledge about co-producing health and well-being, establishing best practice within health and social care sectors, and also to help inform what should be our research questions within the Samskaara programme. And so taking our 4 objectives around measures, mechanisms, leadership and management and models, we've been doing some work led by Daniel Masterson, who's one of the postdoc researchers at Jönköping, around really getting a handle on where the co-production in health and welfare has got to. So just to give you a sense of that scoping work, we've got something like just over 1,000 abstracts that we've allocated to each of the M's, measures, mechanisms, management and models. We're just doing a quality check on all of that. And then we're going to have separate reviews around each of the M's. So that's going on now, and that will help inform and focus the work that we're going to do at the programme level within Samskaara. If you want to know more about the scoping review in particular, then do just get in touch with Dan. Okay, final slide, I think, just to recap. Co-production is not a new concept. Situating co-production with improvement science and healthcare is relatively new, really only sort of, Don Barrett, Paul Cadden talking about it 2015, 2016. It has been going on in other sectors of the public sector, sort of 2008, 2009 was that resurgence in interest. We need to be clear about how we're using the term to avoid risk of denuding it of really its quite radical political meaning, and I think that is a concern, and I think all of us need to be careful about that. But what we're trying to do through Samskaara is to add to lots of other ongoing work that's proceeding now around what are our theories of change relating to the co-production of good health for all. So can we get much closer to explicating what are going on, what are the mechanisms that are leading to certain outcomes, outputs, value through these co-production processes. Because then we can conduct some more theory-based approaches at evaluation, which gets us around some of the definitional problems that I think have up to now plagued lots of work in this area. Okay, I'll stop there. Hopefully that's a little bit longer, but hopefully we've got 15 minutes for questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Glenn. That was really, really clear and very helpful as well to set the scene as to what we are talking about here. We now open up the time for anybody to have any questions. Please feel free to ask Glenn any questions. So you may see on your screen there, if you can unmute yourself, possibly, yeah. And then we will be able to hear you if you've got any questions.
Hello, I could ask a question. Hi, I'm Francis Rowland. You mentioned something there, Glenn, about how some of the approaches have been used in other sectors than healthcare, for 10, 12 years or so. Are there ways that impact has been measured there that you think could be transferred to the healthcare sector?
Yes, so I think there'll be others on the call who may be able to add to this, but my sense is these interesting developments around how we think about public value and how it can be measured, and and managed, my sense is those have emerged much more from the sort of social care sector and other sectors than they have in healthcare. And I think it would be well worth us, as we think about co-production in the context of improvement science and healthcare quality improvement work, to spend some time going back to some of those developments in that sector.
Okay, thanks.
Matt, did you want to ask a question? We can't hear you, actually.
Sorry, I don't have a question at the moment. If you're talking,
no, as in Matt Clack. There's another Matt.
I'm just trying to unmute Matt. He won't. Oh, he's unmuted. Have you got a question, Matt? Oh, his microphone's not working. We can't hear you. Do you want to type it into the chat box, Matt, and we'll read it out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Glenn, Matt's question is around what's the research around the hard and soft skills for co-production?
Okay, so I think there has been quite a lot of work, not in the healthcare sector, but in other sectors, around particularly motivations and motivating people to take part in co-production processes. So, and that can be based as much around altruism as it is around fear of sanctions, and the different types of skills that we need to encourage participation in co-production processes, while recognizing some of those, the dark side of co-production, some of those issues that I mentioned. I think around the hard skills, I think, well, I take this to be, we've done much less around institutional, organizational systems and processes for enhancing co-production. I think that's a major challenge that we need to address as we go forward.
Rosemary, can I ask Glenn a question? It's another Matthew. I was just wondering whether there's any kind of interconnection between the work on co-production and the work looking at healthcare as a complex adaptive system. I don't know whether they either relate or whether that's even a useful lens to use. Is there anything going on there?
Yeah, so certainly, certainly in the way in which Paul Batalden talks about the service dominant logics, and service dominant logics being based around complex adaptive systems, around dynamic processes, then I think there is a clear connection between the two. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, Kathy. I think so. Well, you've written with Paul, so you'll know all about this anyway, I suspect. But so I think so Paul Batalden actually has a visiting chair at Jönköping, where we're doing this research program. So a lot of this comes out of Paul's reflections and Paul's work. I know Paul is very keen. He has an international collaboration around co-production called ICONS, where he's leading various healthcare organizations from around the world through a learning cycle around co-production. And I know that at ISQA in South Africa in a couple of weeks, Paul's leading a keynote there and various workshops. So he's very keen to build the international collaborations around co-production.
Rosemary, it's It's Will Warburton here. Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Go ahead, Will.
Glenn, hi, it's Will from the Health Foundation. I was interested in what you were saying about the organisational capacity and capability to engage in co-production. Are there organisations or institutions that you're aware of that you think are leading the way in this area and that are putting in place systematic approaches to enable this kind of work to take place well?
Yeah, so the international collaboration that I just mentioned in the context of Paul's work is certainly trying to do that. So if you're interested in that, I'd definitely get in touch with Paul and the Learning Network community of practice he's set up around that. I think there's a challenge in that there's some fantastic work going on in the third sector and in service user-led organisations, but it's becoming just so increasingly hard to work in that space. See the demise of those types of organizations and constraints around their budgets. And increasingly, they tend to be being brought into the system rather than operating outside it. And I think that represents quite a challenge. But yeah, certainly get in touch with Paul around his learning network and the work he's been doing for about a year now with about a dozen organizations around the world about exactly that question, about how do we begin to embed, routinize these types of approaches in organizational contexts.
So we've got a question from Louise around the dark side of co-production and how do we best mitigate or to alleviate the risk of some of these elements?
Well, I think there is, so I'm going to link this back to a point that Matt made, I think, earlier. So this is hard work, it's very rewarding, and it takes a long time. And I think we have to stay very close to the fundamental features of co-production or indeed of participatory co-design. My worry is that I hear this prefix co is very dangerous, I think. And the conflation with patient and public involvement in research and co-production somehow being the ultimate form of patient and public involvement. There's a real risk of this becoming normalized within systems and structures that neglect the origins and the very political nature of these processes. I think there is a genuinely difficult question around the private-public value and the issue of equity. Mm-hmm. Who steps into these processes and who do we exclude and how do we manage that? I think that is very challenging and that is a real risk with these types of processes.
Could you comment on Erica's question as well, please?
Yeah. Have you done some? So I think different service line sectors, yes, are more attuned to these types of approaches than others. So certainly in the mental health sector with the survivor user movement, those types of things, there are some very political movements around co-production and the co-production of mental health services. I think in those service lines where patients, citizens have a very ongoing close relationship with healthcare professionals, so for example, some cancer services, etc., then it's much easier to begin introducing these types of processes, or at least looking at the services through these types of lenses. So I'm just picking up on Vicky's one in the chat here. Have you ideas about what outcomes or impacts the co-production measures ought to be linked with? So I'm very interested in the notion of using co-production as a way of democratizing services. So I'm interested in questions of trust and reciprocity and those types of relationships, those types of features of relationships.
Wendy Johnson has another question.
Keeping sharing sealing of power is interesting. How do we? Well, I think yeah. So it's really important to not see this as some kind of zero-sum game where what one hand gains while the other loses. This has to be around, and this is back to Ursula's original work around reciprocity. There has to be incentives for both parties to take part in these types of processes. Otherwise, we really do run the risk of that dark side of this becoming a substitution of labour. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining in the call, and thank you so much, Glenn, for your time and your insights. Actually, it's really been fascinating, and I think we'll all certainly be looking forward to more of the updates of the project. Okay, so just to close that, just a reminder that we will be putting on the recording, and also slides will be available after the call, and do join in our co-production special interest group in our Q community. Okay, thank you so much everyone, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Bye.